I sat motionless at the long banquet table, my hands trembling despite my best efforts to still them. Hit subscribe and the bell icon to discover amazing historical stories with us every week. The oil lamps hanging from the ceiling cast dancing shadows across the faces of the other guests. All of us waiting in tense silence. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I could see the same glistening moisture on the brows of those around me. We were all thinking the same thing, though none dared speak it aloud. Where was Sulla? The room itself was magnificent, as befitted the residence of Rome's dictator. The walls were adorned with frescoes depicting his military victories, the floors covered in intricate mosaics that must have cost a fortune, but none of us cared about the opulence surrounding us. We were here for one reason only: to receive our rewards from the spoils of the proscribed. This was what we, Romans, with our dark humor even in the face of catastrophe, had come to call the Crow's Feast. It was an apt name, like carrion birds descending upon a battlefield. We gathered to pick over the remains of those who had been declared enemies of the state. Their properties, their wealth, their very lives had been forfeit, and now we Sulla's loyal supporters would divide the spoils among ourselves. I had been through many battles in my life, faced enemy swords and shields without flinching, but sitting here in this dining hall filled me with a different kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of physical death, though that was always possible in these uncertain times. No. What terrified us all was the possibility that Sulla wouldn't appear at all. My mind raced with the possibilities. What if his freedman Chrysogonus emerged from those curtained doorways to announce that the dictator was too ill to join us? Or worse, what if Sulla had died? The proscriptions had been ongoing since 82 BC, and it was now nearing their conclusion. Rome had been awash in blood for months, the streets sometimes literally running red with the blood of those whose names appeared on the lists. I glanced around the table at my fellow guests. There was Fufidius, thin as a reed, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he swallowed. Beside him sat Murena, who had grown quite portly from his recent good fortune. Catalina was there too, leaning back in his chair with studied casualness, though I could see the tension in his jaw. We all knew the rules of the proscriptions by heart. They had been seared into our consciousness through repetition and terror. Any person whose name appeared on the lists could be killed by anyone with complete immunity. In fact, killing a proscribed person earned you a reward, 12,000 denarii, a fortune for most Romans. Even slaves could win their freedom by denouncing or killing their proscribed masters. The lists had first appeared on November 3rd, 2 years ago. I remembered that day well. I had been in the Forum when the first whitened wooden tablets were erected, the names painted in black letters for all to see. There had been 80 names on that first list, almost every living magistrate who had been elected under the Sinan regime and hadn't defected to Sulla's side. The 4 remaining Marians of consular rank topped the list: Gnaeus, Papirius, Carbo, and Marius the Younger, who had been consuls that very year, along with Gaius Norbanus and Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiagenus from the previous year. 2 days later, more lists appeared, 440 more names: senators, equestrians, prominent citizens, all condemned to death without trial. Their property was forfeit to the state, their children barred from holding public office for 2 generations. It was a systematic purge of everyone Sulla considered an enemy or threat. But the truly horrifying thing, The thing that kept decent Romans awake at night was that many of the names on those lists weren't there for political reasons at all. They were there because someone coveted their property. Someone wanted their villa, their slaves, their silver mines. All it took was a whisper in Sulla's ear, and a name would be added to the tablets in the forum. I had profited from the proscriptions myself, I won't pretend otherwise. When you live in Rome during such times, you either take advantage of the opportunities presented, or you risk becoming a victim yourself. I had purchased several properties at the state auctions held to dispose of proscribed estates. The prices were ridiculously low, sometimes a fraction of their true value. Sulla's favorites got the best deals, of course, but there was enough to go around for those who had supported him in the Civil War. The sound of footsteps made me jump. We all turned toward the curtained doorway at the far end of the dining hall. My heart pounded in my chest. This was it. Either Sulla himself would emerge, or we would learn of some disaster. The curtain drew back slowly, almost theatrically, and there he stood, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, dictator of Rome, accompanied by his freedman Chrysogonus. The sight of Sulla always shocked me, no matter how many times I saw him. The disease that afflicted him had transformed his appearance into something almost monstrous. His face was covered with red pustules that left little room for patches of unnaturally pale skin. His light hair, which he wore brushed forward over his forehead in loose curls, was slightly damp. He had just come from his bath.
I realized.
The baths provided him with some relief from the terrible itching caused by the sores that covered his entire body. According to the whispers that circulated through Rome, the sores were infested with worms that fed on the pus. The thought made my stomach turn, but I kept my face composed in an expression of loyalty and sympathy. As did all the other guests, we rose as one, turning to face the dictator. Sulla's eyes swept over us, those piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through to a man's soul. He had the most penetrating gaze I had ever encountered. It could reduce strong men to trembling wrecks with a single look. Apparently satisfied with what he saw in our faces, Sulla moved to his chair at the head of the table and sat down. We took this as permission to be seated and lowered ourselves back onto our cushions. Sulla took a scroll of papyrus from Chrysogonus's hands and paused for a moment, letting the silence build. This was his way. He understood the power of timing, of making men wait in suspense. It was one of the many skills that had made him such an effective military commander and such a terrifying political leader. So, Sulla began at last, his voice casual, as if we were discussing the weather rather than the distribution of dead men's property. Let us see what we have for today. At that moment, the doors to the dining hall burst open. A voice called out from the doorway, "Publius Licinius Crassus!" I turned with the others to see who had dared to arrive late to Sulla's banquet. The man who entered was in his early 30s, of medium height but powerfully built. His face might have been handsome if not for his heavy jaw, which gave him a somewhat bull-like appearance. "Admit him," Sulla commanded, and I detected a note of amusement in his voice. As Crassus made his way into the room, I could feel the disapproval radiating from the other guests. Who did this man think he was? What had he done to earn such favor with Sulla that he could arrive late without consequence? I knew something of Crassus's reputation. During the Civil War, he had captured several cities for Sulla's cause, but instead of turning over the spoils to the dictator, As was customary, Crassus had kept the property of the inhabitants for himself and enslaved the people. Anyone else would have lost his head for such audacity. But Sulla had merely scolded him, and now, knowing of Sulla's indulgence, Crassus had the nerve to show up late to this gathering. Sulla smiled at the younger man, a smile that was both welcoming and enigmatic. "You're late, my Publius. You'll have to take a seat in Regium." The joke brought laughter from around the table, and I found myself chuckling along with the others. Sulla had named the far end of the table Regium, after the city in the southernmost part of Italy, near Sicily. It was a clever reference to the way Sulla viewed the entire Italian peninsula as his banquet table, with his supporters seated along its length to feast on the spoils. Crassus took his place between the skeletal Fufidius and the pot-bellied Murena, showing no sign of embarrassment at his late arrival or his relegation to the far end of the table. "Now then," Sulla continued, speaking in the matter-of-fact tone of a man discussing routine business, "what do we have today?" He unrolled the papyrus scroll with a dry rustle that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. Every eye was fixed on that scroll, every mind calculating what properties might be listed and who might receive them. "The Nomentan estate of Lucretius Ofella," Sulla read aloud. He set down the scroll and swept his heavy, penetrating gaze across the assembled guests. "Number the Nomentan estate of Lucretius Ofella." The words hung in the air like a golden prize dangling just out of reach. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Every man at that table knew exactly what this property represented. 10,000 iugera of prime agricultural land, arable fields that stretched as far as the eye could see, vineyards heavy with grapes, olive groves that had been producing oil for generations. The villa itself was legendary, filled with Greek sculptures that Lucretius had collected over a lifetime, Median carpets worth a fortune, table silver that had been in his family for generations, and furniture made from rare black wood imported from Africa, and the slaves by the gods. The slaves alone were worth a fortune. Trained craftsmen, educated Greeks who could read and write, skilled agriculturalists who knew every secret of the land. I watched as Fufidius stretched out his long neck, his eyes bright with avarice. Catalina leaned back in his chair, and I saw his Adam's apple quiver with barely suppressed excitement. Every one of us was calculating what we might offer, what favor we could call in, what service we might promise to secure this prize. But before anyone could speak, I noticed something that chilled my blood. At the far end of the table, in Regium, Crassus was smiling, not the eager, hungry smile of the others, but a calm, knowing smile. It was the smile of a man who already knew how the dice would fall. Sulla set down the scroll and fixed his penetrating gaze on us. I could almost feel the weight of his stare, like a physical pressure on my chest. He was drawing out the moment, savoring our anticipation and anxiety. This was power in its purest form, the ability to grant or withhold fortune with a single word. "I think," Sulla said, stretching out the words like an archer drawing back a bowstring, "I will give the land and the house to Marcus Tullius Decula, who is currently carrying out an assignment for me in Etruria." A collective sigh escaped from around the table, and I realized I had been holding my breath along with everyone else. The sound that filled the room was a mixture of pain and disappointment. The prize had slipped away like water through our fingers. Decula would get the estate a man who wasn't even present to receive it. It was Sulla's way of reminding us that his favor could extend beyond this room. that we weren't the only ones vying for his largesse. As for the slaves of Lucretius, Sulla continued, seeming to take pleasure in our disappointment, I will free them, they will become Cornelii. This pronouncement was met with indifference. Who cared whether the slaves went to Decula or joined the vast army of freedmen who now bore Sulla's family name? The dictator had freed thousands upon thousands of slaves during the proscriptions, creating a massive client base of grateful former slaves who owed everything to him. This pretty boy Chrysogonus, standing beside Sulla, was one of them, a freedman who now wielded more power than many senators. I saw Chrysogonus lean down to whisper something in Sulla's ear. The dictator nodded slightly, his diseased face showing no expression. What new piece of information was being shared? What property would be mentioned next? The house of Avinius, Sulla announced, consulting his scroll once more. His voice took on a harder edge. This scoundrel did not fulfill our expectations. When he learned that his name was on the list, he slit his own veins and ordered his house set ablaze. An empty lot covered with charred beams and ash. That's all that remains of his house and all its wealth. As for his slaves, wait! A voice cut through the room. I felt shock ripple through me like a wave. We all turned our heads in outrage and disbelief. Crassus had dared to interrupt Sulla. The man had arrived late, and now he was interrupting the dictator himself? This was madness. This was suicide. What is it, my friend? Sulla asked, and his voice was smooth as oil, dangerous as a snake sliding through grass. Give the empty lot to me, Crassus called out from his distant seat. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then the dining hall erupted in laughter. It was a release of tension as much as genuine mirth. Murena's belly heaved like a bellows pumping air, his whole body shaking with laughter. Catalina laughed so hard he knocked over a wine cup, splashing its contents onto the snow-white toga of Caecilius Metellus. But Metellus was bouncing in his seat with laughter and didn't even notice the stain spreading across his expensive garment. Crassus wanted the burned lot, the empty space covered in rubble and ash. Had the man lost his mind? We had gathered to feast on the spoils of the proscribed, and Crassus was asking for scraps worse than scraps, for scorched earth. Sulla raised his hand sharply, and the laughter died as suddenly as it had begun. Only Murena continued to shake silently, unable to control his mirth. The dictator's eyes were fixed on Crassus with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it amusement? Approval? Something darker? Take it, my Publius, Sulla declared with a sudden bark of laughter. Chrysogonus. Write this down. I give to Crassus all the empty lots that remain from the houses of my enemies. And just like that, the laughter erupted again. But this time, it was different. This time, we weren't just laughing at Crassus. We were laughing in approval of Sulla's judgment. The dictator was wise and just. To the man who arrives late, give the bones, let him have the worthless rubble, while we, who had arrived on time and shown proper respect, would receive the real prizes. But I noticed something that troubled me, even as I laughed along with the others. Crassus's expression hadn't changed. He still wore that same calm, knowing smile. It was as if he had gotten exactly what he wanted. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of wine and announcements. Properties were distributed. Debts were called in. Favors were granted and received. Some men left that night richer than they had arrived. Others left disappointed, already calculating how they might improve their standing with Sulla before the next gathering. I had done reasonably well for myself, a small villa in Campania. Nothing spectacular, but a solid property that would generate decent rental income. I should have been pleased, but as I made my way through the streets of Rome that night, guided by my torch-bearing slave, I couldn't shake the image of Crassus's smile from my mind. What did he know that we didn't? The next morning, I was awakened early by the sound of construction. At first, I thought nothing of it. Rome was always building, always expanding, always changing. But when I went to the Forum to attend to some business, I heard the news that sent a chill down my spine. Crassus's slaves were already at work on Ovinius's burned property, while the rest of us were still sleeping off our wine from the night before. Crassus had put his plan into motion. His slaves and I now learned that he owned hundreds of them. All trained in construction and architecture, had cleared the site of ash and debris before the sun had fully risen. By midday, they had begun digging the foundation trenches for a new building. "What's he building?" I asked one of the onlookers who had gathered to watch. "An insula," the man replied, using the common term for the multi-story apartment buildings that housed most of Rome's population. 6 stories, they say, maybe more. I did some quick calculations in my head. A 6-story insula on that property. In that location, it would have room for dozens, perhaps hundreds of small apartments, and Rome was desperately short of housing. The proscriptions had displaced thousands of people. Sulla's war veterans were flooding into the city, looking for places to live. The demand for cheap housing was insatiable. Crassus hadn't asked for a worthless burned lot. He had asked for an opportunity. Over the following months, I watched with growing unease as Crassus's strategy unfolded. Within 6 months, that first insula was complete and filled with tenants, plebeians who paid their rent reliably every month. The income from that single building must have been substantial. But Crassus didn't stop there. Burned properties began appearing all over Rome, and Crassus was there to claim every one of them, just as Sulla had promised. His construction crews worked with terrifying efficiency. Buildings that had taken years to construct originally were rebuilt in months, and Crassus didn't just rebuild them, he improved them, making them taller, fitting more apartments into the same space, maximizing every square foot of his properties. Most of the lots he acquired for free. In accordance with Sulla's promise, but when free lots weren't available, Crassus began buying up properties, sometimes whole blocks of ramshackle buildings. He would demolish them and construct his towering insulae in their place. Within a year, it seemed like half of Rome belonged to Crassus. I ran into Fufidius in the Forum one day, and we stood together watching yet another Crassus construction project rise from the ground. We laughed at him, Fufidius said bitterly. We all laughed. We did. I agreed. He's going to be richer than any of us. Fufidius continued. Richer than all of us combined, probably. He was right, of course. Those of us who had received grand villas and country estates had acquired assets that looked impressive, but generated relatively little income. We had to maintain them, staff them with slaves, pay for their upkeep. Meanwhile, Crassus's insulae were money-making machines, generating steady streams of income month after month, year after year. But there was more to Crassus's genius than just real estate. His renters, when they fell into debt, often paid him back not with money, but with votes. Rome's political system ran on votes, and Crassus was accumulating political capital faster than anyone had thought possible. The year 78 BC brought news that shook Rome to its foundations. Sulla was dead, the man who had terrorized the city, who had killed thousands and enriched hundreds, who had held absolute power as dictator, was gone. The disease that had covered his body in pustules had finally consumed him. I attended his funeral, as did most of Rome. Whatever we thought of Sulla privately, it was necessary to be seen paying our respects. His body was carried through the streets in a procession of unprecedented magnificence. The freedmen he had created the Cornelii turned out in massive numbers. Along with his veterans from the Civil War, it was a display of the power he had wielded even more than a mourning of the man himself. With Sulla's death, many expected Rome to return to some semblance of normalcy. The proscriptions had officially ended, and there was hope that the wounds of civil war might begin to heal. But I soon discovered that the consequences of those terrible years would echo far into the future. Many of my fellow guests from the Crow's Feast, those who had laughed at Crassus that night, fell on hard times after Sulla's death. Without the dictator's continued favor, their positions became precarious. Murena lost half his properties to creditors within 2 years. Fufidius became so desperate that people joked he would summon Sulla from the underworld if it might improve his fortunes. The grand estates and country villas they had acquired proved to be anchors around their necks rather than sources of wealth. But Crassus grew richer by the day, by the hour. I learned more about his methods as time went on, and what I discovered both impressed and appalled me. In addition to his apartment buildings, Crassus owned silver mines, some of the most productive in Italy. He owned workshops where slaves produced goods for sale. He owned country estates that generated agricultural income. He owned ships that carried cargo across the Mediterranean. But it was his approach to urban real estate that truly set him apart. I heard a story from a friend who witnessed one of Crassus's property acquisitions firsthand, and it revealed the full extent of his ruthless genius. A fire had broken out in a building near the Suburra, Rome's most densely populated district. Fires were common in Rome. The closely packed wooden structures were like kindling waiting for a spark. When the alarm went up, people poured into the streets, and the owner of the building, a man named Quintus, whom my friend knew, stood watching in horror as flames began to consume his property. Then Crassus arrived. My friend said he appeared almost magically, as if he had been waiting for the fire to start. He approached Quintus with an expression of deep sympathy and concern. "A terrible tragedy," Crassus said, watching the flames spread, "but perhaps not an irretrievable one. I have men who could put out this fire before it consumes everything." Quintus's eyes lit up with hope. "You have firefighters? Please, have them save my building. I'll pay whatever you ask." "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple," Crassus replied smoothly. "You see, my men take on considerable risk when they fight fires, and the building is already badly damaged. I'm not sure it would be fair to ask them to risk their lives for a structure that might collapse on them at any moment." Quintus watched in growing desperation as the flames spread from room to room, floor to floor. Other building owners from neighboring properties began to gather. their faces pale with fear that the fire would spread to their holdings. "However," Crassus continued, "I might be willing to take this burden off your hands if you were to sell me the property at a fair price, of course, considering its current condition. Then it would be my risk to take, and I could in good conscience ask my men to fight the blaze." My friend said. Quintus's face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, outrage, calculation, and finally resignation. He named a price that was perhaps a quarter of what the building was worth. Crassus shook his head sadly. "I'm afraid that's more than I can offer for a building that might be nothing but ashes in an hour." I was thinking more along the lines of, "And he named a figure that was barely a tenth of the property's true value." Quintus tried to negotiate, but Crassus simply stood there, watching the fire spread, letting time do his negotiating for him. Finally, with tears in his eyes, Quintus agreed to the sale. Crassus immediately called out his men. They had been waiting nearby all along, and they sprang into action with remarkable efficiency. Within an hour, the fire was extinguished. The building was damaged, certainly, but far from destroyed. Crassus's slave construction crews arrived the very next day. Within 3 months, the building had been repaired and improved, and Crassus was collecting rent from it. Not only that, but he had also purchased the neighboring buildings from their frightened owners at similarly depressed prices, claiming he was doing them a favor by taking on the risk of being next to a recently burned structure. This wasn't an isolated incident. Crassus had assembled what amounted to Rome's first fire brigade, 500 men trained to fight fires. But they didn't fight fires out of civic duty or concern for their fellow Romans. They fought them only after Crassus had acquired the property at a price that suited him. If an owner refused to sell, Crassus's men would simply stand by and watch the building burn to the ground. It was genius. In its way, ruthless, exploitative genius. Rome desperately needed a fire brigade, but there was no public service to provide one. Crassus had identified a need and found a way to profit from it. That he made his profit from the desperation and misery of his fellow citizens seemed not to trouble him in the slightest. I thought back to that night at Sulla's banquet, when we had all laughed at Crassus for asking for burned properties. He had understood something we hadn't, that in a city as prone to fires as Rome, there would always be more burned properties, and he had positioned himself to profit from every single one of them. His methods weren't limited to fires either. I heard of cases where Crassus would approach the owner of a rickety old building and offer to buy it for a modest sum. If the owner refused, Crassus would purchase the buildings on either side. When Crassus demolished those buildings and began construction on new, taller insulae, the old building in the middle would be left in a depression, overshadowed by its neighbors, suddenly much less desirable. Inevitably, the owner would return to Crassus, willing to sell at an even lower price than originally offered. No method of enrichment seemed beneath Crassus, so long as it promised profit. He traded in slaves not just as labor for his properties, but as commodities to be bought and sold. He trained slaves in various skills and then rented them out to other Romans who needed their expertise. When I needed a Greek tutor for my son, I discovered that the man I hired was actually owned by Crassus, and that half his fee went to his master. By the time we were saying Richest Crassus, instead of the old phrase Richest Crassus, His wealth was estimated to be worth 7,000 talents, roughly equivalent to Rome's entire annual revenue. Some said he owned the greater part of Rome itself. He was careful with his wealth, too. Unlike many newly rich Romans who spent lavishly to display their status, Crassus lived relatively modestly. He didn't build himself a palace or host extravagant banquets. Instead, he reinvested his profits, always seeking new opportunities to expand his holdings. His table was simple. His toga was clean but not ostentatious, and he was known to be generous with loans to fellow senators, though of course those loans came with strings attached. A senator in debt to Crassus was a senator who would vote the way Crassus wanted. I watched his rise with a mixture of admiration and unease. There was something disturbing about the single-minded way Crassus pursued wealth. Most of us sought riches as a means to other ends: political power, social status, leisure, pleasure. But for Crassus, wealth seemed to be the end itself. He accumulated money with the same relentless focus that a conquering general might accumulate territory. Yet I had to admit that his strategy had proven far superior to the approach the rest of us had taken at Sulla's Crow's Feast. While we had grabbed at the most obviously valuable prizes, the grand villas, the country estates, the prestigious properties, Crassus had taken what we considered worthless and transformed it into a fortune that dwarfed our own. The irony wasn't lost on me. We had feasted on the flesh, and Crassus had taken the bones, but he had turned those bones into gold. Number. What do you think about this historical event? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. It was in the late summer of 73 BC when the news first reached Rome. I was in the forum conducting business when I heard men speaking in urgent, worried tones. I moved closer to hear what had them so agitated. 70 gladiators, one man was saying, his face pale. They broke out of the ludus in Capua. Just 70? Another replied with a nervous laugh. Surely that's nothing for Rome to worry about. Send a cohort of soldiers and bring them back in chains. But the first man shook his head grimly. It's not just 70 anymore. They've been freeing slaves from the estates around Capua. Last report I heard, they had several hundred men, maybe more. Led by whom? I asked, stepping into the conversation. A Thracian, the man replied. They call him Spartacus. At the time, I thought little of it. Slave revolts were not unheard of in the Republic. They were typically put down quickly and brutally, with the rebels crucified along the roads as a warning to others. I assumed this would be no different. I was wrong. Over the following months, the news from the south grew increasingly alarming. Spartacus and his followers had defeated a force sent to capture them. Then they defeated another. They weren't just running and hiding, they were fighting and winning. More slaves joined them with each victory, and their numbers swelled from hundreds to thousands. The Senate, initially dismissive of the threat, began to take it more seriously. They sent the consuls Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus with several legions to crush the rebellion. Surely, we thought, trained Roman legions under consular command would make short work of a rabble of escaped slaves. But Spartacus defeated them too. The news of Roman legions being routed by slaves sent shockwaves through the city. This was more than a mere slave revolt. This was a military force capable of meeting Rome's armies in open battle and emerging victorious. I remember walking through the streets of Rome in those days and feeling the tension in the air. Conversations in the forum turned to Spartacus constantly. Merchants worried about trade routes being disrupted. Senators debated strategies in increasingly heated terms, and slave owners, which is to say, nearly every Roman of any means, began to look at their own slaves with suspicion and fear. Were they loyal? Or were they waiting for a chance to join Spartacus? The rebellion moved north, apparently heading for the Alps. The Senate sent more forces to intercept them, and again Spartacus proved victorious. He defeated Gaius Cassius Longinus, the proconsul of Gaul, opening a path to escape from Italy entirely. But then, inexplicably, Spartacus turned south again. No one understood why. He had a clear route to freedom, yet he led his army back into the heart of Italy. Some said he wanted to attack Rome itself, though that seemed like madness. Others said he hoped to reach Sicily, where he could incite another slave rebellion and establish a stronghold. Whatever his reasoning, his southward movement brought the conflict closer to Rome, and fear gripped the city more tightly than ever. It was during this crisis that the Senate made a decision that would prove fateful. They gave command of the war against Spartacus to Marcus Licinius Crassus. I heard the news with mixed feelings. On one hand, Crassus was wealthy enough to raise and equip a substantial force at his own expense. He had military experience from his service under Sulla during the Civil War, and he had the reputation of a man who achieved his goals, however ruthlessly. On the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder at his motives. Crassus never did anything without calculating the potential profit. What did he stand to gain from taking on this dangerous assignment? Crassus was given a praetorship and assigned 6 new legions in addition to the 2 formerly consular legions that had already been defeated by Spartacus. This gave him an army of perhaps 40,000 trained soldiers. It was an enormous force, larger than many armies Rome had fielded against foreign enemies. The rumors that filtered back from Crassus's military camp were shocking. He had revived the ancient punishment of decimation, a practice so brutal that it hadn't been used in Rome for generations. When units performed poorly or showed cowardice, Crassus would divide them into groups of 10 and have one man from each group selected by lot to be beaten to death by his 9 companions. It was a horrifying practice, designed to make soldiers fear their commander more than they feared the enemy. And apparently it worked. Crassus's legions began to fight with desperate courage, knowing that defeat or cowardice would bring punishment worse than death. I thought about the contrast between the Crassus I had seen at Sulla's banquet, calm, calculating, almost serene, and the brutal military commander who would order decimation of his own troops. They were the same man, I realized, the same cold calculation, the same willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. When acquiring property, that meant exploiting desperate fire victims. When commanding an army, it meant terrorizing his own soldiers into absolute obedience. The war between Crassus and Spartacus consumed much of 72 BC and stretched into 71 BC. I followed the reports eagerly, as did all of Rome. It was like watching 2 master strategists locked in a deadly game. Spartacus proved himself a brilliant tactical commander, time and again finding ways to outmaneuver the Roman forces. But Crassus was relentless, using his superior numbers and resources to gradually wear down the rebel army. The decisive moment came when Spartacus reached the southern tip of Italy, near the city of Rhegium, the same city Sulla had jokingly referenced when relegating Crassus to the far end of his banquet table. The irony wasn't lost on those of us who remembered that night. Spartacus had apparently made a deal with Cilician pirates to transport him and some of his men to Sicily. But the pirates betrayed him, taking his money and sailing away without him. Meanwhile, Crassus built fortifications across the isthmus, trapping Spartacus and his army. The rebels were besieged, cut off from supplies. It should have ended there, but Spartacus managed to break through Crassus's fortifications in a desperate nighttime assault, and the war dragged on. However, the momentum had shifted. Crassus's legions began winning engagement after engagement, killing thousands of rebel slaves and forcing Spartacus to retreat. Then came news that complicated matters further. The Senate, apparently doubting Crassus's ability to finish the job, had sent for reinforcements. Pompey the Great was being recalled from Spain, where he had been fighting against the rebel general Quintus Sertorius. Marcus Licinius Crassus, fresh from victories against King Mithridates in the east, was also being summoned. I could imagine Crassus's reaction to this news. He had taken on the most dangerous military assignment any Roman general had faced in years. He had spent his own money equipping and supplying his legions. He had brutalized his troops into an effective fighting force. He had pursued Spartacus across the length of Italy, and now, just when victory was in sight, the Senate was sending Pompey and Lucullus to share or steal the glory. Crassus must have been furious, but more than that, he must have been terrified that Pompey would arrive and claim credit for the final victory. Pompey was already celebrated as one of Rome's greatest generals, despite his young age. If he arrived in time to deliver the killing blow to Spartacus, the glory would be his, and Crassus would be remembered as the general who couldn't finish the job. So Crassus pressed his attack with renewed urgency. His legions caught up with portions of Spartacus's army and engaged them in a series of bloody battles. The rebel forces, depleted and exhausted, began to fall apart. Small groups broke off from the main army, attacking the Roman legions independently without coordination. Finally, Spartacus made his last stand. With his forces dwindling and the Roman legions closing in from all sides, he turned to face Crassus in open battle. It was a desperate gamble. But Spartacus had no other choice. If he continued to run, his army would be picked apart piece by piece. At least in battle, there was a chance, however slim, of breakthrough or victory. The battle was fought in Lucania, in the high Sele Valley. I wasn't there, of course, but I heard accounts from soldiers who survived it. They said Spartacus fought like a man possessed, cutting his way through the Roman lines in a desperate attempt to reach Crassus himself. But the Roman legions were too numerous, too well trained, and too thoroughly terrorized by their own commander to break. The rebel army was routed. Thousands upon thousands of slaves died on that battlefield. Spartacus himself was killed in the fighting, though his body was never found among the heaps of corpses. Some said he had been cut down while fighting toward Crassus, his body so hacked and trampled that it was unrecognizable. Others claimed he had escaped and lived out his days in hiding somewhere beyond Rome's reach. But I think the first story is more likely. Spartacus was many things, but he was no coward. He wouldn't have fled while his men were dying. 6,000 rebels who survived the battle were taken prisoner by Crassus's legions, and what Crassus did with them sent a message that echoed throughout Italy and beyond. He crucified them all. Every single one of them was nailed to a cross, and these crosses were erected along the entire length of the Appian Way, from Rome to Capua, a distance of more than 100 miles. I traveled that road shortly after the crucifixions, and the sight was something I will never forget. Miles and miles of crosses, each bearing the body of a man who had dared to rise against Rome. Some were still alive when I passed, though barely, moaning in their agony. Others were already dead, their bodies being torn apart by crows and vultures. The smell was overwhelming, the stench of death and decay that hung over the road like a fog. It was a message, of course. This is what happens to slaves who rebel. This is what Rome does to those who challenge her authority. But I think it was also a message from Crassus to Rome itself. Look at what I can do. Look at my power. Look at my ruthlessness. Pompey arrived just after the final battle, too late to claim any real credit for defeating Spartacus. But being Pompey, he managed to turn even this to his advantage. His forces encountered some 5,000 rebel slaves who had escaped from the main battlefield, and he slaughtered them all. Then he wrote to the Senate claiming that while Crassus had defeated Spartacus's army in battle, it was Pompey who had ended the war by eliminating the last of the rebels. I could imagine Crassus reading that dispatch, his jaw tightening in barely controlled rage. He had spent his own fortune, commanded a massive army, pursued the rebels across Italy, revived the brutal practice of decimation, and fought the bloodiest battle against slaves in Roman history. And Pompey was claiming credit for ending the war by mopping up survivors. The rivalry between Crassus and Pompey would shape Roman politics for years to come. But that's a story for another time. What I want to tell you now is what the war against Spartacus revealed about Crassus's character, and how it connected back to that night at Sulla's crow's feast. See? Most of us at that banquet had seen the proscriptions as a one-time opportunity. We grabbed what we could during that brief window when Sulla was distributing the property of his enemies. We walked away with our prizes and considered ourselves fortunate. But Crassus understood something deeper. He understood that Rome was entering an age where wealth and military power were becoming inseparable. He understood that the traditional paths to power, noble birth, prestigious ancestors, distinguished military service were no longer sufficient. In this new Rome, money was power, and power generated more money. The war against Spartacus was an investment for Crassus. Just like his apartment buildings and his fire brigade, he spent his own money to equip those legions, yes. But he knew that defeating Spartacus would bring him prestige, political influence, and opportunities that would repay that investment many times over. And he was right. After the war, Crassus's political career flourished. He was elected consul, the highest office in Rome, along with Pompey. The two men, despite their rivalry, formed an alliance that dominated Roman politics. Crassus continued to grow his wealth through various means, both legal and questionable. He lent money to ambitious young politicians, including a promising young man named Julius Caesar, and collected political favors along with the interest on his loans. I saw him occasionally in those years, usually at public events or in the forum. He had aged well, maintaining his powerful build and adding an air of distinguished authority to his bull-like features. We never spoke of that night at Sulla's banquet, but I sometimes wondered if he remembered the laughter that had erupted when he asked for the burned properties. Did he think about how we had mocked him? Did he take satisfaction in how wrong we had all been? I think he probably didn't think about it at all. Crassus wasn't the type to dwell on past slights or savor past victories. He was always looking ahead, always calculating the next opportunity, always seeking ways to expand his wealth and influence. But I thought about it. I thought about it often, especially as I watched my own fortune slowly dwindle while his continued to grow. The villa in Campania that I had been so pleased to receive at Sulla's feast generated modest income, but it also required constant maintenance and attention. Meanwhile, Crassus's hundreds of apartment buildings churned out profits with minimal oversight. His slave-operated silver mines extracted precious metal from the earth day after day, year after year. His merchant ships crossed the Mediterranean, carrying goods and generating returns. The other guests from that night fared no better than I did. Murena died in debt, his estate seized by creditors. Fufidius ended his days in near poverty, sustained only by the charity of distant relatives. Catalina became embroiled in a conspiracy to overthrow the government and died in battle against Roman legions. Even Caecilius Metellus, who had seemed so prosperous and secure, saw his family's fortunes decline. But Crassus became wealthier than Croesus, that legendary king of Lydia whose name had been synonymous with riches for centuries. When people wanted to describe someone of extraordinary wealth, they stopped saying rich as Croesus and started saying rich as Crassus. And it all traced back to that moment at Sulla's banquet when he had asked for something we all considered worthless: the burned lots, the charred ruins, the bones from the feast. I learned a lesson from watching Crassus's rise, though I learned it too late to profit from it myself. The lesson was this: in times of chaos and upheaval, the greatest opportunities often come disguised as disasters. The fires that consumed buildings, the proscriptions that destroyed families, the slave revolt that threatened Rome. Crassus found ways to profit from all of them. Where others saw catastrophe, he saw opportunity. Where others saw worthless ruins, he saw the foundation for an empire of wealth. There was something almost inhuman about it, I thought. Most men are constrained by conscience, by sympathy, by a reluctance to profit too openly from the suffering of others. But Crassus seemed to have no such constraints. He would buy a burning building from a desperate owner at a tiny fraction of its value and feel no shame. He would crucify 6,000 men along a road and view it as a political statement rather than a moral horror. He would decimate his own troops, order them to beat their companions to death, if it made the survivors more effective soldiers. Number yet, I couldn't quite bring myself to hate Crassus, despite having every reason to do so. There was something almost admirable about the purity of his ambition. He wanted wealth, and he pursued it with single-minded focus, letting nothing stand in his way. In a Rome increasingly dominated by hypocrisy and pretense, where politicians claimed to serve the Republic while enriching themselves, at least Crassus was honest about his goals. He wanted to be rich, and he made no apologies for it. Still, I sometimes wondered, what did Crassus want all that money for? He didn't spend it lavishly. His lifestyle remained relatively modest. He didn't host spectacular games in the Circus Maximus or throw legendary banquets that would be talked about for years. He didn't build himself a palace that would rival the homes of kings. So, what was the point of accumulating such vast wealth? I think the answer was simply that the accumulation itself was the goal. For Crassus, wealth was how you kept score. It was proof of his intelligence, his cunning, his superiority over other men. Every additional denarius in his coffers was validation that he was smarter than everyone else. And in a way, he was right. He had been smarter than all of us at Sulla's banquet. We had seen the short term, the immediate reward. He had seen the long term, the sustainable source of wealth. We had taken the fish. He had taken the fishing net. As the years passed and I grew older, I found myself thinking more and more about that night. It had been a turning point, not just for Crassus, but for Rome itself. The proscriptions had marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The old Roman Republic, with its traditions of shared power and collective decision-making, was dying. In its place was emerging something new and more ruthless. A Rome where individuals with enough wealth and military power could dominate the state. Sulla had been the first to demonstrate this with his dictatorship, but Sulla had ultimately stepped down, restored some semblance of the old system, and retired to his villa. He had wanted power, yes, but for a specific purpose: to reform the state according to his vision. Once that was accomplished, he was content to let go. Crassus represented something different. He wanted wealth not for some higher purpose, but as an end in itself, and he would keep accumulating it endlessly, never satisfied, always seeking more. There was no point at which he would say, "Enough. I have sufficient wealth now." Because for Crassus, there was never enough. I heard stories about his later years that illustrated this perfectly. Despite being one of the richest men in the world, he would still personally inspect his properties, checking that his slaves were working efficiently and his managers weren't stealing from him. He would haggle over prices in ways that struck others as beneath the dignity of a man of his status. He tracked every denarius that came in and went out, maintaining detailed accounts that he reviewed regularly. His relationship with Julius Caesar became particularly important in his later years. Caesar was a young man of noble birth and enormous ambition. But he had one critical problem. He was deeply in debt. He had borrowed heavily to fund his political career, hosting games and distributing largesse to win popular support. Crassus, recognizing Caesar's potential, became his patron, lending him vast sums of money. It was a brilliant investment. Caesar's political career flourished, and as he rose, so did Crassus's influence. When Caesar needed money for his campaigns in Gaul, Crassus provided it. When Caesar needed political support in the Senate, Crassus delivered it. In return, Caesar advanced policies that favored Crassus's business interests and made sure that Crassus's allies received favorable appointments. This was the new model of Roman politics. Not the old aristocratic families sharing power among themselves, but wealthy patrons backing ambitious clients in a relationship of mutual benefit. Crassus had helped pioneer this model, and it would dominate Roman politics for decades to come. The alliance between Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, what historians would later call the First Triumvirate, was the culmination of this new system. Three men, through a combination of military power, popular support, and vast wealth, effectively controlled the Roman state. They divided consulships and military commands among themselves, overrode the Senate when it suited them, and pursued their own interests while claiming to serve the Republic. I watched this unfold with a mixture of fascination and dismay. The Republic my father had told me about, the one I had been raised to revere, was becoming a shadow of itself. Power no longer resided in the Senate or the assemblies of the people, but in the hands of a few extraordinarily wealthy and ambitious men. And at the center of it all, in many ways, was Crassus. Not as the most prominent figure that would be Pompey, with his military victories, or Caesar, with his brilliant oratory and magnetic personality, but as the money man, the one who made it all possible. Crassus was the foundation upon which the new order was built. I thought back to that moment at Sulla's banquet when he had interrupted the dictator to ask for the burned properties. At the time, it had seemed like either madness or a joke, but it was actually a declaration of intent. Crassus was announcing, to anyone perceptive enough to understand, that he saw the world differently than the rest of us. While we were focused on what was already valuable, he was focused on what could become valuable. While we were thinking about immediate rewards, he was thinking about long-term systems of wealth generation. The burned properties were just the beginning. The fire brigade was the next step. The apartment buildings were the foundation. The silver mines, the workshops, the ships, the slaves, all of it was part of a comprehensive strategy to turn every possible source of income into a stream flowing into Crassus's coffers. And it had worked. By the gods, it had worked beyond anything anyone could have imagined that night at Sulla's feast. I was old now, living on the income from properties that seemed paltry compared to Crassus's vast holdings. My son would inherit what I had, and it would be enough to maintain him in modest comfort. But he would never be wealthy. Not truly wealthy. Not Crassus wealthy. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I had seen what Crassus saw that night. What if I had asked for the burned properties too? What if I had thought to create a fire brigade? Or to build apartment buildings? Or to invest in slave-operated industries? Could I have built a fraction of what Crassus built? Probably not, if I'm honest with myself, because it wasn't just about seeing the opportunity. It was about having the ruthlessness to exploit it. When a man's building was burning and he was desperate to save it, could I have stood there calmly negotiating to buy it at a fraction of its value when my own troops showed cowardice in battle? Could I have ordered every 10th man beaten to death by his companions? When I saw 6,000 defeated rebels, could I have had them all crucified along 100 miles of road? I couldn't have done those things. I had too much conscience, too much sympathy, too much of what my father had taught me about honor and dignity. Those qualities had made me a decent man. But they had also ensured I would never be as wealthy as Crassus. There was a price to be paid for that kind of wealth, I realized. Crassus had paid it, though whether he recognized the cost was another question. He had sacrificed something, perhaps his humanity, perhaps his soul in pursuit of his fortune, and he had gotten what he wanted. He was rich beyond measure, powerful beyond most men's dreams. But was he happy? That was the question I could never answer, because I never knew Crassus well enough to see beneath his surface. He always wore the same mask of calculation and control. I never saw him laugh freely, never saw him weep, never saw him show any emotion that wasn't carefully measured and deployed for effect. Maybe that was the final cost of his wealth. To accumulate so much, he had to turn himself into a kind of machine, a wealth-generating device rather than a fully human being. Every interaction had to be calculated for profit. Every relationship had to be weighed in terms of advantage. Every decision had to be measured against the standard of material gain. It was perhaps fitting, then, that Crassus's downfall, when it came, was rooted in that same calculating approach to life. In his later years, having achieved wealth beyond measure and having served as consul, Crassus began to feel that something was missing. He looked at Pompey, celebrated for his military victories across the Mediterranean, and at Caesar, who was carving out an empire in Gaul and sending back reports of glorious battles. Crassus had defeated Spartacus, yes, but a slave revolt, however dangerous, didn't carry the same prestige as conquering foreign kingdoms. Crassus wanted military glory to match his financial success. He wanted to be remembered not just as the richest man in Rome, but as one of its greatest generals. And so, despite being in his 60s, he sought and obtained a command in the East, with the goal of conquering Parthia. I remember hearing about this decision and feeling a sense of foreboding. Parthia was no collection of escaped slaves or disorganized rebels. It was a powerful empire, with sophisticated cavalry tactics and a strong military tradition. And Crassus, for all his success against Spartacus, was not really a military genius. He had won through superior numbers, brutal discipline, and relentless pursuit, advantages he wouldn't necessarily have against the Parthians. But Crassus was confident. He had calculated the potential rewards, the wealth of Parthian cities, the glory of conquering a great empire, the prestige that would put him on equal footing with Pompey and Caesar. He assembled his legions, gathered his resources, and set out for the East. I never saw him again after he left Rome for that campaign, but I heard the news when it came back, and it struck me like a physical blow despite not being particularly surprised. Crassus had led his army deep into Parthian territory, pursuing what he thought was a retreating enemy. But the Parthians were employing a tactical withdrawal, drawing the Roman legions away from their supply lines and into terrain that favored Parthian cavalry. At a place called Carrhae, the Parthians turned and attacked. The battle was a disaster. The Parthian horse archers surrounded the Roman legions, raining arrows down upon them from a distance while staying out of reach of Roman swords and spears. When Roman soldiers tried to close with the enemy, the mounted archers would simply ride away, maintaining their distance while continuing to shoot. It was a tactic the Romans had no effective counter for. Crassus's son, Publius, commanding the Roman cavalry, was killed in the fighting. His head was cut off and paraded before the Roman lines on a spear. Crassus, seeing his son's severed head, finally understood that he had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't like fighting Spartacus. This was a different kind of warfare entirely, and he was outmatched. The Parthians offered to negotiate, and Crassus reluctantly agreed to meet with their commanders. But it was a trap. The meeting turned violent, and Crassus was killed. Some accounts said he was struck down in the confused fighting that erupted. Others said the Parthians executed him deliberately. One particularly grim story, and knowing the Parthian sense of ironic punishment, I wouldn't be surprised if it were true, claimed that the Parthians poured molten gold down Crassus's throat, saying, "Now sate yourself with the metal you so craved in life." That last detail was true. The broader facts were undeniable. Crassus was dead, his son was dead, and the legions were destroyed. Of the 40,000 soldiers Crassus had led into Parthia, only a fraction made it back to Roman territory. It was one of the worst military disasters in Roman history, and it had been entirely preventable. When I heard the news, I felt a strange mix of emotions. There was sorrow. Certainly, Crassus had been a fellow Roman, and any Roman death at foreign hands was cause for mourning. There was also a grim satisfaction that perhaps the gods did maintain some kind of justice after all. Crassus had profited from death and suffering throughout his career. Perhaps it was fitting that he met his own end in battle, his greed having led him to overreach. But more than anything, I felt a sense of recognition. Crassus's death was the logical conclusion of the way he had lived. He had treated warfare as just another investment, calculating the potential returns without fully appreciating the risks. He had underestimated his enemy because he was so accustomed to being the smartest man in the room, the one who saw opportunities others missed. But the Parthians had been smarter, and Crassus had paid the ultimate price for his miscalculation. I thought back to that night at Sulla's banquet. More than 3 decades earlier, I could still see Crassus walking into the dining hall, late but unabashed. I could still hear the laughter that erupted when he asked for the burned properties. I could still remember how smug we had all felt, how certain we were that we had gotten the better prizes while Crassus had been given worthless scraps. How wrong we had been. Crassus had turned those scraps into an empire of wealth. He had become the richest man not just in Rome but possibly in the world. He had achieved everything he set out to achieve on the financial front. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. He had wanted more, specifically, the military glory that would put him on the same level as Pompey and Caesar. And that desire, that refusal to be satisfied even with unprecedented wealth, had destroyed him. There was a lesson in that, I thought. Perhaps the greatest risk of wealth isn't poverty, but the inability to recognize when you have enough. Crassus had been brilliant at seeing opportunities and exploiting them, but he had never learned to recognize limits, to acknowledge that some things couldn't be acquired through calculation and ruthlessness. In the days after news of Crassus's death reached Rome, I found myself walking past some of his properties. The apartment buildings still stood, still housed their tenants, still generated income for whoever would inherit them. The workshops still operated, the silver mines still produced, the ships still sailed. Crassus had built something that would outlast him, a wealth-generating machine that would continue operating even with its creator gone. But what was it all for? Crassus was dead on a battlefield far from Rome, his body mutilated by his enemies, his military ambitions shattered. All that wealth, all those carefully accumulated denarii, all those properties and mines and slaves, what good had they done him in the end? I suppose they had done him exactly the good he had wanted from them for most of his life. They had made him wealthy. They had made him powerful. They had made him important. And for most of his life, that had been enough. It was only at the end, when he looked at Pompey and Caesar and felt his own glory was insufficient, that the wealth ceased to satisfy him. Maybe the real lesson was this: if you're going to dedicate your life to the pursuit of wealth, as Crassus did, you must be content with wealth alone. Once you start wanting other things, glory, honor, recognition as a great general, your strategy becomes confused, and you start making mistakes. Crassus's mistake was forgetting what had made him successful in the first place. He had succeeded by seeing opportunities others missed, by being patient and systematic, by building sustainable systems of wealth generation. But military glory couldn't be achieved through those methods. It required different skills, different thinking, and rather than recognizing his limitation, Crassus had assumed that the same approach that made him wealthy would make him a great general. The Parthians had taught him otherwise, but by then it was too late to learn from the lesson. If you enjoyed learning about this piece of history, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more fascinating stories, and let me know in the comments which historical period you'd like to explore next. Now, as I approach the end of my own life, I find myself reflecting on that night at Sulla's banquet more than ever. It has become, in my memory, a kind of symbol for everything that happened to Rome in my lifetime. We gathered that night as carrion birds around the spoils of the proscribed, dividing up the property of dead men, congratulating ourselves on our good fortune. We thought we were the winners, the survivors, the ones who had backed the right horse and now would reap our rewards. But history had other lessons to teach us. Most of us who sat at that table ended badly. Some died in poverty, some in disgrace, some in battle against Rome itself. Even those who survived, like me, never achieved the wealth or power we had fantasized about that night. The grand estates we had received proved to be burdens as much as blessings, requiring constant attention and generating less income than we had hoped. Only Crassus had truly won, at least for a time. He had seen what we couldn't see, understood what we failed to understand, and acted with a decisiveness and ruthlessness that none of us could match. He had turned worthless burned properties into a fortune, turned desperate fire victims into profit centers, turned the chaos and suffering of Rome into opportunities for wealth generation. And yet even Crassus, for all his success, ultimately failed. He died far from Rome, his body mutilated, his military reputation destroyed, his ambitions unfulfilled. All that wealth couldn't save him from his own ambition, couldn't protect him from the consequences of overreach. So what's the meaning of it all? What lesson am I supposed to draw from a lifetime of watching Crassus's rise and fall? I think it's this: wealth and power, pursued as ends in themselves, are ultimately hollow. They can give you comfort, security, even a kind of immortality through the institutions you build, but they can't give you satisfaction, can't give you peace, can't make you fundamentally happy. Crassus had more wealth than almost any man in history, and it still wasn't enough. He still wanted more glory, more recognition, more achievement, and that insatiable hunger led him to his death. Meanwhile, I sit here in my modest villa, neither rich nor poor, neither famous nor infamous. I have enough. My needs are met. My son will inherit a decent property. My life has been comfortable if not luxurious. And you know what? I'm content. I don't lie awake at night calculating profits or planning acquisitions. I don't scheme about how to exploit the next disaster for financial gain. I sleep peacefully, my conscience relatively clear. Could I have been Crassus? Could I have made his choices, employed his methods, achieved his success? Probably not. I lacked his ruthlessness, his calculating nature, his absolute focus on wealth accumulation. But even if I could have, even if I had it to do over again, knowing what I know now, I'm not sure I would choose his path. Because Crassus, for all his wealth, was never truly free. He was enslaved by his own ambition, chained to his endless pursuit of more. Every fire in Rome was a potential opportunity he had to evaluate. Every political development was a chance to advance his interests. Every interaction was a negotiation. He lived his entire life in a state of constant calculation, never simply being, always strategizing. That's no way to live, I think. Better to have enough and be content than to have everything and still be hungry for more. Still, I can't deny that part of me admires what Crassus achieved. When I walk through Rome and see his apartment buildings towering over the streets, housing thousands of Romans, I'm impressed by the scale of his ambition and the effectiveness of his execution. When I think about how he turned that request for burned properties, that moment when we all laughed at him, into the foundation of a financial empire, I have to acknowledge the sheer brilliance of his vision. And when I remember that final banquet, with Sulla's diseased face looming over us all, I realize that Crassus was the only one who truly understood what that moment represented. The rest of us saw it as a feast, a celebration, a distribution of rewards. Crassus saw it as what it really was, the beginning of a new Rome, a Rome where wealth and ruthlessness would matter more than noble birth and military valor, a Rome where the rules were being rewritten and fortunes were there for the taking. If you were smart enough and cold enough to grab them, he grabbed them. By the gods, he grabbed them with both hands and never let go. And if his grip eventually pulled him over a cliff in Parthia, well, at least he died having achieved something extraordinary. He transformed himself from a moderately successful military officer into the richest man in the world. He turned the garbage into gold, the bones into a feast of his own. The rest of us laughed at him that night, but Crassus had the last laugh, even if it was cut short by Parthian arrows. I'm old now, older than Crassus ever got to be. My hands shake when I write, and my vision is failing. Soon I'll join all those others from Sulla's banquet in the underworld, Murena, Fufidius, Catalina, Crassus himself. I wonder what we'll say to each other when we meet again. Will we talk about that night? About the choices we made? About how it all turned out? I imagine Crassus will still be calculating, even in death, figuring out how to corner the market on whatever passes for currency in the underworld. Probably looking for burned properties to rebuild, fires to exploit, opportunities to seize. That was his nature, and I don't think even death could change it. As for me, I'll be content to rest. I've had enough of ambition, enough of schemes, enough of trying to get ahead. I've learned, slowly and painfully over the course of a lifetime, that enough, not a lesson Crassus ever learned. But then again, if he had, he wouldn't have been Crassus. So here's my final reflection on that night. On the crow's feast, on everything that followed, we were all crows, picking at the corpses of the proscribed. Some of us picked better than others. But we were all scavengers, all complicit in Sulla's terror, all willing to profit from other people's suffering. We laughed and drank wine while dividing up the property of men who had been murdered for political convenience or personal avarice. Crassus was just more efficient at it than the rest of us. He was a better crow, a more successful scavenger, but he was still a crow, still a carrion bird feeding on death. And in the end, he became carrion himself, food for the birds in Parthia. The wheel turns, the feast ends, and we all eventually feed the crows we once were. That's the real lesson of the crow's feast. Not that you should be smarter about seizing opportunities, or more ruthless about exploiting disasters, or more calculating about accumulating wealth. The real lesson is that when you feast on death, you eventually become the feast. I wish I had understood that when I was young. I wish I had walked away from Sulla's table, refused to participate in the distribution of proscribed property, chosen a different path. But I didn't. None of us did. We were too caught up in the moment, too eager for our share of the spoils, too convinced that we deserved our rewards for backing the winning side. And so we ate at the crow's feast. All of us, Crassus included. Some of us got richer from it than others, but we all paid a price, one way or another. Some paid with their lives, some with their fortunes, some with their souls. I paid with my peace of mind. Even now, decades later, I can still see those whitened tablets in the forum with their lists of names. I can still remember the fear on people's faces as they checked to see if they or someone they knew had been proscribed. I can still recall the sight of severed heads displayed on the rostra and the 6,000 crosses along the Appian Way. These are the memories I carry into my final years. These are the ghosts that haunt my dreams. And when I think of Crassus' brilliant, calculating, ruthless Crassus, I wonder if he was haunted too. Did he lie awake at night thinking of the people whose burning buildings he had bought for a pittance? Did he remember the faces of the 6,000 slaves he had crucified? Did he ever question whether all that wealth was worth the price he had paid to acquire it? I'll never know. Crassus kept his own counsel, showed no weakness, revealed no doubts. Maybe he had none. Maybe he slept peacefully every night, confident that he had simply been better at playing the game than everyone else. Or maybe, in his final moments on that battlefield in Parthia, with his son dead and his army destroyed and Parthian soldiers closing in around him, maybe then he finally understood. Maybe then, as the molten gold was allegedly poured down his throat, he realized that all his calculations had been for nothing, that all his wealth couldn't save him, that he had spent his life accumulating what could not protect him in the end. But probably not. Crassus was Crassus to the very end, I imagine. Still calculating, still strategizing, still thinking about the next opportunity even as death claimed him. That's who he was. And that's who he died, as the man who asked for the burned properties at the crow's feast and turned them into an empire. The man who saw opportunities where others saw only disaster. The man who was smarter than all of us, richer than all of us, and just as dead as all of us in the end. May the gods have mercy on all our souls. We were the crows at the feast, and now we must answer for it.